Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Time to Rethink the Use of Sulfates in Dairy Rations webinar. Thank you for attending. David will present himself in a minute. I'm Chantal van Lin. I'm your host of today. I just wanted to take you through a few of the small details I want to address. So, David, if you can just change the slide.
Of course.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks. We're more than happy if you want to raise questions, but please we should use the questions panel in your GoToWebinar tool panel so we can see them come in, because everyone is on mute to make sure that we have not too much background noise. So feel free to ask your questions by typing them into the questions panel that you see here on screen. We will see them and address them during the webinar or after the webinar in the Q&A session. Webinar will be recorded and available upon request. Same goes for the handouts. So if you want to have them both or one of them, please reach out to David or to me, and we will share them with you with pleasure. One small disclaimer. Please note that all the product names and claims mentioned in this webinar are generic and can differ a little bit from your own local situation. So please contact your local Selco or Trouw representative to discuss your needs and options. Or as with the recordings, you can contact David or me, and we will help you further. So with no further ado, I'll just give the floor to David. Enjoy the webinar and good luck, David.
Thank you, Chantal, for the first slide. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning for some, good afternoon to others. Thank you for the opportunity to be here sharing a little bit of about our background we have in trace minerals, and also how the sulfate mineral can affect your dairy ratios. That's about the conversation today. So as I mentioned, my name is David, as Chantal mentioned as well. So a little bit about my background for those who we did not get introduced yet. So I'm a vet by background. I originally from Brazil. That's where my accent came from. A little bit after I finished the vet school, moved to the US for the graduate school. So I spent a little bit about 6 years in the US and then come to the industry about 12 years now, working in the animal feed industry, in special with feed additives for ruminants. So previously with several other feed additives and nutritional companies. So today my family and I live in the Netherlands, and I'm glad to be here sharing a little bit of our knowledge and also learning with you a little bit more about the trace mineral supplementation to dairy cattle. Thank you for your time, and I hope this presentation can contribute a little bit for the experience and also to the knowledge that you can bring abroad. So starting the presentation, let's go a little bit for the agenda that we have today. So you're going to talk a little bit about how trace minerals are essential, and because they are essential, we must to make choices and to decide which source you're going to work with. And then I'm going to describe a little bit and bring a little bit about of the research background that Trouw Nutrition has done in the previous 25 years regarding the impact of the sulfate and also trace mineral supplementation and the nutrient stability in feed, also feed palatability, the impact in rumen function, also the impact on mineral bioavailability, and how that also impacts the environment. And then you can have a wrap up and a summary, and you'll be open for questions regarding the presentation. So as Chantal has mentioned, this information and any other information, please contact us. We're going to have some contact information at the end. The handouts, the presentation, and other questions we'll be very glad to answer. And I hope you enjoy the presentation. So for starting right now, we must remember that trace minerals, let's say metals, the trace metals are essentials. That's important information to start because when it comes to the choice of trace mineral source we're going to work with, we generally try to bring that as in a feed additive context, where when you talk about feed additives, you have so much feed additives that has no nutritional values, because they can, of course, improve performance and other requirements and other things that relate to the dairy cow performance, and perhaps digestibility of fiber, perhaps milk production, perhaps reduce the heat tolerance. But in generally, when you talk about minerals, we talk about the requirements. So cows need metals, and that is about first information in this presentation. So they are essential. The trace minerals such as zinc, copper, manganese, selenium, iron, they play important role in the physiology and metabolic of the dairy cow. So they need for several functions, including protein synthesis, also epithelial tissue integrity, reproduction, immune response, is very important component, some enzymes, and also even for oxygen transport in the hemoglobin, trace minerals are used. So you must remember that. But doesn't matter the type of source you're gonna work with, trace minerals are identical. So zinc is zinc and copper. And that's an important point in the conversation. So because trace minerals only have a nutritional value to the animal when they are absorbed across the intestinal wall into the animal's bloodstream. Once the trace metal has been absorbed, only the animal can direct where and how the trace metal will be utilized within its physiology. So in this case, trace mineral products in a simple way just provide a form to facilitate the handling of the trace mineral or the trace metal in feeds. So coming to that, I like to use this slide that I learned from Kevin, which is in the presentation, also going to be answering some of the questions to you. I'm glad Kevin is here, Kevin Perlman is here to also be here join the presentation. So talk a little bit about, let's say, animal mineral status and performance. So we all know that if you do not offer the right amount, or if in some case we exceed the amount, can cause problems to the animal. So we can sometimes lose animals, but at least poor performance or in other parameters poor performance such as reproduction, diseases can be affected. So as feeding and as we are in the feed nutrition industry, as feeding and nutrition expert, we try to provide via premix and also base mix the amount of minerals necessary to fulfill the requirements. So we also try not only to provide to one animal but also for the herd. So that's what's happened. So in the basal ratio, you know, the amount of mineral that is required for the animals is not enough to fulfill the needs. We provide the amount of the requirements by the premix. So that's a way you can keep in an optimum balance all the mineral status of the animal. But the truth is, when we want to be more effective or sharp to delivery these trace minerals and fulfill the requirements in large scale, you have to make decisions on mineral source. And then we move to source that might improve the chance to have the metal ready to absorption in the intestinal wall. And that's the case when it comes to work with a more bioavailable or source that is less soluble, less reactive in the GI tract, that can offer a higher metal amount. So this is about what you do on a daily basis when you work with minerals. You try to fulfill, you know the feed doesn't provide everything. So when you take the decision to choice, we are trying at least to make sure that the most of the animals can be in an optimal balance of trace minerals. So talk a little bit about probability. And I believe this can be a very nice slide to think, because when you talk about trace mineral, you talk about a very small amount of mineral or of metal. So if you think about 30 kilograms of milk per day hosting lactating dairy cow, let's say about 150 days in milk, pregnant, that cow must receive around 10 milligrams of absorbed copper per day. And that's the size of what represents 10 milligrams, even a little bit less than that. So very small amount. You depend on what age you are, or if you use a glass or not, maybe you cannot even see how much that represents. It's very small amount. And then when you come to a herd of 250 cows, we are talking about this herd consuming 2.5 grams of copper per day. And that is the size of 2.5 grams of copper per day. 1 euro cent coin, a very small amount for an entire farm, for an entire big herd, like 250 lactating dairy cows. You must be aware when you talk about a source, about trace minerals, a small amount, so you must be really consistent with the choice you decide to deliver all this method to make sure the animal is going to receive and going to be in an optimum balance of mineral. So if you have to take decisions, what gonna be our choice options in those decisions. And for this reason, I bring a little bit of the history of the use of the trace mineral source. So trace mineral supplementation started with oxide formings in the 1930s and moving to more available source of sulfate about in the 40s, 50s after the Second War, when the technology advances allow for more efficient sulfate production. So, and that was the movement that happened. And you still work with those sources today, but you understand the value of each one of those two sources. And to further improve bioavailability and effectiveness, organic trace minerals were introduced in the 70s. And while many organic trace minerals delivered improved results, and we know this, their lower metal concentration in combination with the high cost meant producers only replace a small fraction of the animal's total trace requirement. Then in the 90s, hydroxy trace minerals were developed as a more concentrated and cost-effective improved trace mineral source, allowing then complete replacement of the inorganic sources. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the source differentiation, talk about bounds and also the results. But I want to bring a little bit about some information about oxide before we go further, because as we understand, first, oxides are let's say it's the first choice that you had in the beginning of the supplementation of trace minerals to provide to the animals. But you must make sure when you're going to have the decision to use oxide, what are the risks we are assuming by this choice? So, in other words, why we should avoid to use oxides? Of course, when you compare to sulfate, they are much less reactive, but they also offer a very big challenge as well. So, as we can see here, that's a coefficient of absorption from the NRC 2001. And when you compare to among all inorganic sources, oxides are recognized to have the lower efficiency of absorption. So if you compare copper oxide versus sulfate, sulfate are 5 times more efficient to deliver the copper than the oxide, 2 times more than the zinc, and 4 times more than the manganese. That's important information that you already have in the background, but and there is a reason why this oxide causing these type of things. Internal data from us can show a little bit more about this information. So first thing that I should avoid to use the oxide in the animal nutrition, especially for the dairy cattle rations, is because the process that is used to produce oxides is done for other type of industry, such as rubbers, tires, and concrete. And once they are produced, they are graded. So, and those with less contamination, such as heavy metals or where they understand better the concentration, they can be offered to the food and feed grade. So we kind of part of the material that's being produced that go to our type of industry. So in this information that I share with you, that's internal data developed by PARC Institute and also Nutreco R&D back in the 1999. So we compare the sulfate, as you can see in green, with 17 suppliers of zinc oxide, different suppliers. So, and that comes from different processes, and there are many variation results with the process. In special, most of the zinc oxide that in the feed industry comes from the Vowes process. And as you can see, the relative bioavailability compared to sulfate for the Vowes process samples or the suppliers vary a lot, from 30 to 60% of relative bioavailability, also offering less than sulfate, but with very big variation. Of course, some processes, the indirect process, can offer much closer with a little variation, but still variation. But this type of process is more used for other type of industry, as some pharmaceutical and analytical. You must be sure that is not the same type of source that you use for the feed industry. And so my question would be, how can we predict the amount of zinc to available for absorption in our formulation using this type of zinc oxide? We cannot really guarantee or predict what would be the response, and also cannot guarantee what would be the delivery of the metal to the animal. And a more recent study also done by Nutreco internally by the Master Lab, you have tested the solubility of zinc oxide in pH 2.0 compared to also IntelliBond with the hydroxychloride minerals that we work and supply and develop it. So in the case of the IntelliBond zinc, we know that IntelliBond zinc is soluble in pH before 4.0. So in this case, in 2.0, we have a complete solubilization of the IntelliBond zinc. But when you compare to the samples from the zinc oxide from different suppliers, and those are the major suppliers used in Europe, not just from us, but for the most of the premix company, we're going to use the same supplier. So you can see a big variation, and also even using the same type of process, and some process even is not recognized which process is used, because most of the time zinc oxide came from dealer. We cannot guarantee what would be the solubilization. So what is, in other words, there is a big impact in the absorption in the future, because you don't know if I talk about a 30% solubilization after 30 minutes, or even 40 after 1 hour, or perhaps 60 or 70 after 1 hour. So they are insoluble in neutral pH, but also still in pH 2.0 for a very, very long time. Big variation. You should try to avoid to use this type of source. And those are going to be my slides talk about oxide. From here now, we're going to talk about sulfate that's being recognized as an inorganic source of trace emitter to be used in the industry after the 40s and the 50s, and what we can expect when using sulfates, and what you can expect when using IntelliBond as a replacement of the total sulfate supplementation in dairy cattle rations. Okay, let's talk about our options then again: sulfates, organic, hydrox. And talk about our options. You can see that a sulfate trace emitter contains a metal ion bond to a sulfate ion via the ionic bond. So sulfates, ionic bonds. And when it comes to organic and hydroxy, you're going to see some difference. And it's important to mention that in the case of the sulfate, these ionic bonds break apart easily in a moisture, water, aqueous environment, releasing the free metal ion. In the case of the copper here, to interact with other nutrients and microbes in the rumen. And that's what we want to avoid. Organic and IntelliBond, in the case of the hydroxy IntelliBond, trace emitter contains stronger covalent bonds. As you can see here in my pointer, the red light here, the red point. And these covalent bonds protect the metal from being released too early in the feed or digested tract, giving them the advantage in the diet stability, palatability, digestibility, and also bioavailability over the sulfate trace minerals. Talk about stronger bonds compared to more weak bonds. But it'll be very interesting to take a closer look at the product differences right here. I'm gonna use these slides come from our colleague Sarah Katwider from the ruminant team in the US. And she had put all this together for the Cornell University Nutrition Conference earlier last year. So it's very, very clear and nice animation to example and to illustrate the differences among the source. And the first message I can bring here, and I'm going to repeat that a few times in the presentation, everything is about bonds. As I have mentioned earlier in the slide, the difference between anorganic, organic, and hydroxy trace mineral are are about their bonds. So in order to demonstrate that, I'm going to use this presentation that she put together. So we're going to talk a little bit here. Let's think about a table salt, the sodium chloride. It could be even a sulfate, a zinc sulfate, or a copper sulfate. So what happens when table salt or other type of salt dissolve in water? We have two options here. One option, they get dissolved, or they get dissolved and associated, and that would be the option 2. And the right question is option 2. So table salt and the other type of salts in moisture, water, or aqueous environment, they really get dissolved and disassociated. And why? Because they have weak bonds, ionic bonds. You must remember that. And let's use a second example here, talk about, which can be more familiar, more common to us, like a table sugar, like sucrose. So what's happening when sucrose dissolves in water? You can have two options as well. First option, they get dissolved, or the molecules get, or the sugar gets dissolved, and also the molecules break apart. So let's say you have the ions breaking apart. And the right answer right here would be option 2. The molecules go to solution and breaks apart. That's what's happened. Sorry, the answer here would be option 1. the molecules go to the solution but do not break apart. And why? Because they get dissolved but do not disassociate. And why that's happening? Because that's covalent bonds. We are talking about stronger bonds which do not disassociate in aqueous solution. So covalent bonds keep atoms together when the substance dissolves, and ionic bonds allow atoms to disassociate when the substance dissolves. And that's the differentiation about when we talk about inorganic trace mineral or organic trace mineral, and also hydroxychloride trace mineral, such as IntelliBond. So, as I mentioned, first key message and the most important message in the presentation: trace mineral nutrition is all about bonds. Why? Because more weak bonds we have is more solubility and also more reactivity, and which means more oxidation, antagonism, stability, less absorption, less digestibility, and also less performance. That's what you can expect when you talk about a source of trace mineral that's higher in solubility and reactivity. And talk about this, considering the fact that sulfates are very reactive source of trace mineral. Right now, I will show what we have learned on sulfates impact on essential nutrient stability, and also feed palatability, ruminal function, bioavailability, and also the impact on the environment. So I'm going to summarize here some of the 25 years of research done by Trial Nutrition regarding the use of sulfates and also hydroxychloride and organic trace minerals, and how that affects the daily of the feeding, feeding and nutrition of dairy cows. So first, nutrient stability. We, as a background, we all know that vitamin stability is often compromised when trace minerals were included in the premix. Furthermore, when sulfate or free metals were included in the premix, stability of vitamin E, A, and also K were decreased to a greater extent compared to organic or even oxide trace mineral, indicating that trace mineral source impact vitamin availability. And this is what this research that I'm presenting here is about, where IntelliBond copper has shown from 20 to 70% more vitamin E retention in complete poultry diets containing 200 ppm of copper versus 200 ppm of copper from copper sulfate after 10 to 40 days in storage, which later correspond as well in this research for a higher live vitamin E and lower plasma vitamin E when these diets were fed to chicks. So in dairy supplements, if you're going to bring the case and feed, are very common to find increased amount of fatty ingredients such as rapeseed meal, cottonseed meal, soybean meal. All those products have a residual amount of fat, and this fat is not protected. So this amount of unsaturated fat in combination with oxygen means reactivity. Sulfate sources such as copper, zinc, and manganese speed up this oxygen reaction, or in other words, these sulfates metal sources intensify the oxidation of the fat in the feed. When this reaction starts to speed up, the vitamin E, including the formula, which is supposed to be used for the animal as a source of vitamin E, starts to serve as antioxidant to prevent this oxidative reaction in the feed, trying to offset the oxidation that's going on the fat. So that's end up to burning all the good part of the tocopherol that include in the feed. And that's what you can see in this trial that I just presented right now, in this graph that I just presented right now. So less vitamin E available, not just in the feed, but also available in the animal. That's what we don't want to even consider the higher price of the vitamin E nowadays. So a little bit more of feed stability information. This is another good study to illustrate feed stability and how sulfates can compromise the feed stability. Work done by the Purdue University. In this case, sources of copper, but remember, not just copper, but also zinc sulfate works exactly the same. Increased amount of copper in the feed reduce the phytate hydrolysis in some source of mineral, such as the copper citrate, copper chloride, and in special copper sulfate. Remember, to have the phosphorus available for absorption most of the ingredients in the diet, the phosphorus must be released from the phytate. So in this case, for some reason, metal like copper and zinc antagonize with the phytate, and so the hydrolysis could not happen. And if you have like these free metals connect to the phytate, you really reduce the amount of hydrolysis, so the availability of the phosphorus is much lower. And that's what's really happening here when you see this type of source. Of course, when that comes to IntelliBone and also to the copper lysine source, the amount of hydrolysis is still the same, so the amount of phosphorus being released from the phytates is also still the same. And that's what we're expecting in this case. So IntelliBone could clearly keep the phosphorus easy with increased amount of copper from 0 to 500 ppm in the diet. One thing that I just want to add here, maybe you consider like a 62.5 ppm of copper too much, but generally the dairy diets that you supplement about 15 ppm of copper, 50 of zinc, and also if you consider a little bit more what's contained in the diet, we talk about levels higher than 62.5. So in this case, you can expect also in diets that considering all the sulfates that we work with in dairy cows, higher amount than that, which can be very active. The sulfates can be very active compared to the IntelliBone. So IntelliBone also in this case can keep the release, or let's see the phytate hydrolysis keeping as supposed to be. Of course, inorganic source like citrate, chloride, sulfate, very reactive, is inexpensive, and IntelliBone can really reduce can really improve the phosphorus release compared to the other source. And of course, here is a summary of all the studies that you have done in this matter, consider the essential nutrient stability, and compared to, and not just using the vitamin E or even the phytates, but also here including also vitamin A, riboflavin, also lipid oxidation, and so you can also even show all the benefits and improvements most of the trials compared to the sulfates. So a less soluble, less reactive source such as IntelliBone can keep the essential nutrient stability in feed, which is going to be very welcome to the animal and to the performance of them in the future. So a little bit about now feed palatability, which you can also talk a little bit more about the information regarding sulfates and also hydroxychlorides. Several studies across a variety of species have shown, and consider not just ruminants, but also swine and poultry and other species more domestic, like pets. We also, so all these studies across a variety of species have shown that when given the choice, animals prefer to consume IntelliBone rather than sulfate source of trace mineral. And the reason behind the reason behind is this increased palatability may be related to the high reactivity of sulfate trace minerals due to their weak ionic bonds and metallic taste. Animals prefer one choice to the other. A sequence of studies done at the University of Florida by Professor John Arton using calves have also showed the negative impact of the sulfates when it comes to the preference and intake of different types of supplements, including also free choice mineral, feed, and also molasses tub. In the study that I'm presenting right here, by removing sulfate sources of copper, zinc, and manganese, calves receiving supplement, the intake jumped from 20 grams per day for 160 grams per day. And the difference was just because one supplement contains sulfate and the other doesn't contain sulfate. Sulfate really impact the preference choice and the palatability of the feed, as you can see in this trial, along of 14 weeks in creep-fed beef calves. So additional to that, we can bring a second study that was a sequence of the first one, which done by the same research group. Compared to the sulfate, IntelliBone increase the intake by 26%. no difference when compared to supplement without addition of mineral. One comment that I believe is very important here is that I have this picture showing how the trial, showing the calves in the trial. As you can see in the bank, you see like 3 buckets where they could choose. So they really could choose which supplement they want. So those were really preferential intake design installed. The calves were able to choose among the 3 treatments and they pick the one they prefer. In that case, they could have no mineral supplementation, sulfate inclusion or hydroxide inclusion. And as you can see, comparing to sulfate, hydrox will increase the intake of the calves. And to finalize our information regarding the effect of the trace mineral source on palatability, in the same sequence of the same group, University of Florida, sequence of studies, all that published in the Journal of the Animal Science. You could also compare to not just sulfate versus IntelliBond, but also how would be some organic source of trace mineral. In this case, compared to even organic or sulfate, the IntelliBond also presents much higher supplement intake. Impact the mineral. In this case, also we could evaluate the percentage of the intake of the mineral. So because the animals are eating more supplement with IntelliBond, they were able also to increase the intake of trace minerals such as copper, zinc, and manganese. So in this, and because they prefer the supplement, if in some reason they need more copper, zinc, and manganese, those metals were available to them. And this is what about even before we talk about what's happened in the body of the animal or in the physiology or in the metabolism of the animal, we talk like before that, there is effects on feed that can really reduce the availability of metals or reduce the availability of other nutrients. But we are also talking about preference here, animals, what type of source of trace mineral the animals prefer to have before they go further in the physiology. And that's where we are going right now. So let's talk a little bit about the effect of the sulfates and also IntelliBond on the ruminant function. It's well understood that microbial activity in the rumen is essential to promote optimizing neutral detergent fiber digestibility, which is fundamental to be the production of volatile fatty acids as an important energy source to the ruminant. Metals such as copper, silver, zinc, manganese have, and especially copper and zinc have are very low because of their antimicrobial properties that are utilized as antimicrobial agents and antibiotic alternatives in other industry. And right here, I bring some of the example of how copper sulfate is being used by its antimicrobial properties to control pathogen bacteria in hospitals, and that's really affect our well-being and life for let's say for humans. But everyone that is present in this presentation, you understand very well what this picture means, because in a daily basis in a farm, in a dairy farm, we also use copper sulfate as a source of antimicrobial agent to foot bath treatments of the dairy cows. And you know why you use that, because you want a very soluble source of copper, which make sure that the copper gonna be free and available to react or to interact with the bacteria and control the population and treat the foot of our cows. That's what we're looking for. So when it comes to that, we know the antimicrobial effect of these type of metals like zinc and copper, and you are doing this in a daily basis in a farm. Would that have some effect in the rumen? That's the question that came along when we talk about the effect of the supplementation of sulfates for dairy cows and how that can affect the ruminal environment. Reactive trace mineral sources are very counterproductive because once broken down in the rumen, the metal ion, that could be the zinc or even the copper, originally linked with the sulfate ligand, now possesses the antimicrobial properties. Consequently, these free metal ions can potentially harm to the beneficial fibrolytic bacteria. To confirm it, this is a very traditional work to evaluate the effect of the increased concentration of zinc and copper, as you can see, either in washed rumen and also in rumen fluid. So as you can see in the graph right here, 20 ppm of free copper decreased the concentration of the cellulose digested from 80% to 20%. And the same reduction also was observed for zinc, as you can see in light blue, when work with 80 ppm. So considering general dairy supplements, which we provide about 12 to 15 ppm of copper, plus 50 to 60 ppm of zinc, additional to the 5 or 8 ppm of copper and the 15 or 30 ppm of zinc from the basal ingredients, we are easily reaching the levels of damage demonstrated in this trial. So in other words, it's not difficult to reach levels that can cause reduction in the rumen fiber digestibility. These are traditional studies back in the 70s. Now we're going to go further with more information regarding more recent studies. And then bring us to some other research discussion. This is some work done at the Colorado State by Caldera and co-works. They have 8 animals in the study. They were fistulated, and also they provide the bolus capsules into the rumen at the beginning of the feed program, containing 20 ppm of copper, 60 ppm of zinc, 40 ppm of manganese from 2 different sources, sulfates or IntelliBond. And every 2 hours, they pull out the rumen fluid and centrifugate, and then they took the liquid portion and look at the soluble zinc, copper, and manganese. Just to mention, in this case, the animals, the steers, were being fed with a diet of 50% corn silage and 50% steam flake. And now the supplementation of the copper, zinc, and manganese, as I mentioned, comes from the rumen bolus not being offered in the feed. So in this slide, it's very clear to see that rumen soluble copper concentration was affected by dietary treatment. You can see copper sulfate in light blue, IntelliBond zinc in dark blue, and as much as they go on in the hours. So soluble copper concentration were lower in steers receiving IntelliBond C versus the copper sulfate, up to 2 to 12 hours post-dosing of the bolus. I believe the key point here is all this area under the curve. So everything from this top to the bottom is reactive copper. So all this volume is free copper, ready to kill microbes in the rumen, also to antagonize with other structures in the digest. And this is what you want to avoid when you supplement a mineral that you expect to be being absorbed in the future, but also don't want to have any negative effect in the rumen population. Right here, free copper. And the same result happened to zinc, and also the same thing you could see to manganese. Even if the manganese form is not antimicrobial as sulfate as the copper and the zinc source, but certainly this manganese is binding with another nutrients antagonist in the rumen. So as a summary, you have a very good picture to show the magnitude of the reactivity of the sulfate source of trace minerals in the rumen, according to this research trial. As I mentioned before, we could see like how the free metals can cause damage in the bacteria population. So what can we expect when a bacteria population is being damaged? And that what I'm gonna try to bring in some of the information I'm gonna show in the next 2 slides. So yes, we can expect change in the because of the damage in the bacteria population of the rumen. And some of these changes can be measured by the production of the volatile fatty acids. So why? Because they are product results from the bacteria fermentation in the rumen. In this study done in the North Carolina State under the Dr. Jerry Spears group, is also in agreement with the previous work that I just presented from the Colorado. In this work, supplementing 90 ppm of zinc, even from IntelliBond or sulfate, resulting in lower rumen soluble zinc concentration, and when growing steers were fed with corn silage diet for 85 days. As a result, you can see the impact of the copper sulfate versus IntelliBond in the volatile fatty acid production. In other words, copper sulfates at 90 ppm reduce the production of the volatile fatty acids, what did not happen with the sulfate, with the IntelliBond. So, effect by causing damage to the bacteria population in the rumen. What else can you see when talk about the effect of the, let's say, free metals in the rumen, such as copper and zinc? or when you work with a very soluble reactive source of trace mineral. In terms to summarize the information that we have developed along the years here in Tron Nutrition, we have this waterfall graph that we can show this. 10 of 12 studies done in collaboration with other universities and research facilities, we were able to show a positive effect of the NDF digestibility when replacing sulfates by IntelliBond. This fiber digestibility improvement means more energy available to the animal. If for some reason this cow is energy limited, let's say a early lactation cow that the energy can turn to being milk. If that's a heifer, the energy can go to growth. If that's a cow in a late lactation, perhaps this energy can go to body reserves. So, but also as a nutritionist and work with feeding nutrition on a daily basis, we can consider these 3 or 4 points of extra digestibility of NDF to create some cost reduction in the diets and also add more value to the customer. And that's about the value when you can really avoid the damage that sulfate or very reactive source of trace mineral causes in the rumen. You are losing something here. And what we are losing, and we can put in a better words, if you go back to some research done in Michigan State, it will be much more clear to understand that. So let's say in this word, what's the value of the NDF digestibility for dairy cows? According to Dr. Oba and Mike Allen from Michigan State, for any 1 point of NDF digestibility up or down is equivalent for 250 grams or a quarter kilo of a 4% fat correct milk. So checking, if you consider this, in this case, we talk about our average, consider what the result to compare when you replace the sulfate by IntelliBond. We are expecting an average for 3 to 4 points. So let's see something about like a 3/4 kilo, perhaps 1 kilo extra of milk, correct for 4% of fat. So if you check the average price today, milk in Europe about 25 euro cents. So incremental cost by replacing sulfates for IntelliBond probably costs around 1.5, perhaps 2.0 euro cents. So if you have invest 1.5 or 2 euro cents to receive back 25 cents, it's a very good return on investment. And that's something that you're gonna have in mind. That's the investment you do to have the contribution to have a less reactive source of cost-effective source, less reactive in the diets of your dairy cows. And what I like more about this is because this is only based in the corrective problem of the rumen. You just talk about the reactivity in the rumen. So it has nothing to do with the value of the IntelliBond increasing trace mineral absorption. It's just the effect of the source of the trace minerals, not how the metal will be much more available. So, and how in the impact of the IntelliBond in the cow health and productivity is addition to that, and I'm going to present right now in the next slide. So it's still very highly return on investment as well, even if you're not considering the benefits to have a much more bioavailable source of trace mineral. Let's talk a little bit about the mineral bioavailability. And we know absorption coefficient, NRC estimate like the efficiency of absorption from zinc and copper about 10 to 4%. Of course, you understand this as really is biology, is a moving target. There's many factors influencing bioavailability. We can talk about species, genetics, age, sex, physiological state, also effects on the mineral solubility and other things. So all this can affect this. But when you go to IntelliBond, what you know about the relative bioavailability of IntelliBond? We know that IntelliBond make a better work than sulfate to get the metal absorbed. These 2 studies, and they are published, you can see Animal Science Technology and also both in the Animal Feed Science Technology 2004 and 2017. These 2 studies reviewing the relative bioavailability of IntelliBond compared to the sulfate. In the case of copper, relative bioavailability were based on liver retention of copper. In the case of the zinc, relative bioavailability based on the balanced trial, consumed minus extracted is equal to the retained amount of metal and amount of zinc. In other words here, the efficiency when you talk about, you understand from the cause of copper sulfate is IntelliBond about 196% compared to the sulfate, and in the copper sulfate, in the case of the zinc sulfate, 100% versus 204%. So we are talking about here, in this case, like if you consider like according to the NRC, talk about 4% is the efficiency of absorption of the copper in the copper sulfate. You talk about to be moving to 8%. In the case of the zinc, from 10 to 20. And that's what we are talking about when talk about bioavailability. And that's how you can use this information to formulation and also to expect the amount of metal to be delivered. So just to put this in a better picture, I put here two cases, one of the copper sulfate and zinc sulfate. Let's considering we have 100 milligrams of copper sulfate. In 100 milligrams of copper sulfate, you know that 25.5 milligrams is copper and 24.5 milligrams is something else like the sulfate in the water. So this is the concentration of the copper in the copper sulfate. But of all this copper, we know because the efficiency is about 4 or 5%, we are talking about only 1.275 milligrams gonna be absorbed copper, and of course 24.225 milligrams gonna be wasted. And that's what's happened in the case of the copper sulfate. In the case of the zinc sulfate, we know the concentration is about 36.5. So 100 milligrams, 36.5 milligrams is zinc, and 63.5 milligrams sulfate in the other and water. So this is just the part of the metal concentration. But you know the efficiency of absorption of this zinc sulfate is about 10–12%. So in this case of this 36.5 milligrams, you are just talking about 4.38 milligrams of absorbed zinc. What's happened when you talk about this 200% expectation of the IntelliBond? You are talking about moving, in this case, the copper sulfate doubly, like from 1.275 to 2.550, 550. In the case of the zinc sulfate, we are moving from 438 to 8.76. That's why you can expect and work with this type of more high available metal. But remember, that's biology. This is the moving target. There's a lot of things that can affect, but that's how you could use the information regarding to the bioavailability. And that bring to us that IntelliBond is more a predictable trace mineral source. If you remember the beginning of this presentation, I was presenting a little bit about how much represented 10 milligrams of copper, and how much 250 cows are in need of copper per day. That's about €1 coin. So it's not that much. So if you talk about precision nutrition, you must be working more predictable source of trace mineral, and IntelliBond can bring that to us differently than sulfates. So you talk about what you have learned with research compared to the sulfates with the IntelliBond. And little bit more thing about the relative bioavailability, and then I'm moving to the end of the presentation. This is a Cornell study. It's a very nice study done in Cornell University. So 60 cows assigned in 3 treatments. One treatment is completely inorganic. The second treatment is a combination of inorganic and organic trace mineral for copper, zinc, and manganese. And of course, the third treatment, they will receive a completely IntelliBond program with copper, zinc, and manganese. So cows receive treatment diets from 28 days before parturition to 84 days in milk. In this slide, it's very nice because you're going to be able to present the ability of the animals to react to inflammation and also to oxidative stress. As you can see here, you have some parameters such as a marker, such as 2-barbituric acid, total antioxidant capacity, and haptoglobin. So 2-barbituric acid reactive substance plus the total antioxidant capacity IntelliBond treated cows reduce both of these parameters, which means that IntelliBond treated cows reduce the oxidative stress, which means they are metabolically healthier compared to the other treatments. As you can see in light blue compared to the dark blue, that there is a reduction. In the case of the haptoglobin, is a non-specific acute phase protein, but are very sensitive and a great marker for inflammation and disease, in special metrias. In this case, so any challenge regarding inflammatory response bring the level of haptoglobin up. So in this case, we see clearly that the IntelliBond program could reduce the level of the haptoglobin, which means that IntelliBond treated cows compared to the other treatment were able to control better the inflammation, or in other words, use less the resource to fight the metabolical and the physiological changes, as well any other pathogen interaction challenges that happen during this transition period. So all this information together is to show that in the case of this study, cow receiving IntelliBond program experience a better transition period with a healthier status. And if they are experiencing if the cows are healthier, experiencing a better transition period, what can we expect? Exactly, we can expect more milk, and that's the case. So IntelliBond cows peak early and also peak higher than the other treatments, push about 3.5 kilograms of milk per day at peak. So, and we all know what 4.5 kilograms of milk means. And this effect of milk is a combination of things. Higher metal absorption, as we mentioned, because of the relative bioavailability of the product. Also less use of energy and also other nutrients such as amino acids from the body to fight inflammation, immune response. Also more intake as a result to be in the cows to be in a healthier state to receive a more palatable feed, and of course higher digestibility of the NDF, which results in higher available energy in the rumen. Also to complete the bioavailability set, we have this study done by my good friend Alex Souza, which was back then he was a faculty member in the University of California in Davis. So the research was done in a commercial farm, about 25,000 lactating dairy cow in the Central California. In the farm, they have their own barn to turn to develop research. Big farm, very used to do research with other test products and also test programs. So all this barn was very completely adapted to evaluate the trials and also to do science. So the idea here was to understand the effect by moving a diet where the mineral supplementation or a combination of IntelliBond C and also zinc sulfate with part organic and manganese sulfate to an entire IntelliBond C, Z, and N program. Immediately after calving, the cows were assigned one of those two treatments and continue to receive this treatment diets until 100 days in milk. It's not normal by practice, but the good thing about this trial, as you can see here, they synchronize for supervolation the cows around 65 days in milk. So to repeat the same moment when the regular service starts in a commercial farm. Those who are familiar with time AI or embryo transfer knows that no one is crazy to supervolate cows or collect embryo before 100 days, in the case of lactating dairy cows, but mainly because of the embryo quality issues. But in this case, you want to understand what happens to the embryo in about 8 to 10 weeks after calving. As a result, calving's cows who receive complete IB program improve the number of viable embryos by 31% when compared to the all-collect structure, and also 37% when compared to the only fertilized structure, which brings us to very interesting results. And also, and perhaps the most important information, in my opinion, the number of higher quality freezable embryo improved by 95%, almost double the population of higher quality freezable embryos, which the farmer really appreciate because they probably could be selling these embryos overseas, including going to Brazil and other areas in South America, which are part of their business beside the milk. So this very nice information showing again what would be the opportunity to have more available metal to be absorbed. The animal can decide how to use, but you need to have the metal over there, not connect to antagonists, not being reactive to other things, must to be free delivered the right moment in the right concentration to the animal to be used. And that's what's IntelliBond about. And that's what we understand after this 25 years of research, that sulfate, when you use sulfate in formulations, can be a risk because you cannot control all these things because it's a very reactive, very soluble source. So, and my last piece here in finalizing is about the how environment matters, and we know all this. So as a follow-up to our early slide looking in the impact of copper for copper forming on the phytate conversion to phosphorus in the gut, this data set looks at the amount of phytate being excreted to the environment. You note that as the level of copper in copper sulfate is increased, the amount of undigested phytate coming from the animal is significantly increased, wasting both phosphorus and also copper. You will note here that the IntelliBond C allowed for the efficiency of conversion of the phytate to phosphorus by phytase in the upper GI tract. In other words, IAB supplementation you support to improve the amount of phosphorus to be absorbed, and also you reduce the amount of phosphorus to be wasted in the environment. So environment matters in special countries such as where I'm living now, Netherlands, and also other countries in European areas in North America that phosphorus is turned to be more and more a problem. Any technology that can support the strategy to reduce the output of manure and also phosphorus in the environment can be very helpful. So besides you being absorbing more phosphorus, which can have benefit to the animal, you are talking about reducing dose, but in special, you talk about to have less phosphorus in the environment. So as a summary, we could see the risk to be using sulfate and also the benefit to replace sulfate by IntelliBond in nutrient stability, feed stability, rumen function, mineral bioavailability, and also the impact on the environment such as I just presented to you. And that's, I finalize the presentation, and I'll be glad to answer some question. I know you're short in time, but any other question in the future, please don't hesitate to contact us by the email I just put here in the presentation.
Well, thank you, Davi, for your explanation and your presentation. Indeed, we have just a few moments. Luckily, we already answered a few of the questions. Well, I have one from Jonathan. Do you expect or see the same negative impact of magnesium sulfate versus oxide or chelated sources, for example?
This is a very good question, and that especially because of the oxide. So what we can talk about the difference. So the variation of process to be producing zinc oxide is much higher in the case of zinc than the manganese. Okay, so in the case of the zinc oxide, we can, even with this variability of production, because most of the products are graded after production, we can control a little better the concentration of heavy metals, but you cannot never control the relative bioavailability, because in that case, the process is going to impact it profoundly, and also the variation in the process is going to impact it a lot. So considering how much zinc you'll be absorbing in the case of the zinc, you cannot control that, and that's the problem with the zinc oxide. When that comes to the manganese, of course, there's not that much process considering, and we have reviewed some of the information available for several species in terms of relative bioavailability. The variability of the manganese oxide relative bioavailability is not that large, or the range is not that large as much as you see in the zinc oxide. But for the other side, you see a lot of problems with heavy metals, like the concentration of iron, in special aluminum, and also lead, you'll be very high. So maybe you can gain a little bit about relative bioavailability, but you're going to lose a lot about the concentration of heavy metals. Just another thing to mention, in the case of the manganese, beside the heavy metals, you're also going to see a higher concentration of manganese metal that's not oxide. In other words, this manganese, you're not going to be absorbed. And there is one more piece of information to that.
He's talking about magnesium.
Not manganese, magnesium.
No, impact of
sorry,
magnesium.
I thought they talk about the manganese. I'm sorry about this. So I have not much to add considering macro ingredients. Okay, sorry. But in the case of manganese, that's what I talk about. I'm sorry. I thought I understand manganese, because manganese can be a very risk.
Understand. Okay, well, just have, I think, a few minutes for the last question. Eduardo is asking that one. Can we use only organic sources for all of trace minerals, 100% organic?
For all trace minerals, that's a very dense conversation, right? I mean, let's talk a little bit about this. There is very decent source of good, organic trace mineral, very good source, very well research developed on this. But you know, there is a very huge and big impact on the delivery of this when you talk about when replace all the inorganic source for organic trace minerals. So, and because of this, most of the information we have, when you consider to that, they are working with partial replacement. Remember, the organic trace minerals, they are lower in concentration, and also they are also not stable as much as you can see in the hydroxy trace minerals. In this case, you can do it if you go to a rice with a good source, but the economical impact to be doing that is very high when you compare to hydrochlorides.
Okay, well, looking at the time, we are run out of time. Thank you for answering the questions, David. Thank you all for asking them, because that's even more important. We have a few questions still. We will answer them via email in the coming days, so no worries. If you have any questions or remarks, feel free to contact David or me, or use the celco.marketing@trouwnutrition.com. And we will make sure that we address your question or any remark that you have. So again, thank you, David, for the presentation, and thank you all for joining this webinar. Stay tuned on LinkedIn for the other webinars that we are planning for this series. And again, have a really nice day. Thank you for listening, and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chantal. Thank you all for to be present. Have a good day.